Now, earlier this week during the policy committee discussion on Monday, you referred to the current week as the week that was. And truly, in every sense of that statement, I believe that's coming to fruition. So, with the situation in Cyprus, which broke last weekend, I'm assuming that a number of people know what the situation is, that the private banks were suffering, and in exchange for the suffering of the private banks, the potential bankruptcy of these banks, the people of Cyprus were the intended victims who were to suffer. So it was announced that the Cypriot banks would require a 10 billion euro bailout. And just to get a little perspective, that's about 1/3 of the country's GDP. And this idea was hatched not within Cyprus. This did not arise from the Cyprus parliament, but from the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. And now, Cyprus was going to be the guinea pig for a new bailout mechanism called the bail-in. And you really have to hand it to the authors of this policy for being so innovative with these terms. But the bail-in was intended to be a tax on depositors. Anybody with fewer than 100,000 euros, which is covered as much like the FDIC coverage in the United States, guaranteed. Under 100,000 euros was to be taxed at about 6%, just taken out of the account. Over 100,000 was to be taxed at approximately 10%. Now, that was voted down in the parliament with an immense outcry from the people of Cyprus. But anyone who believes that voting down of the expropriation of measure of depositors was the end of the crisis is frankly nuts. So the most recent one of the more recent developments that will hatch over the weekend is that the ECB is threatening to cut off all liquidity to Cyprus if they're not able to come up with 5 billion euros over the weekend. That if they're not able to come up with that money, then when the banks eventually open, which is apparently scheduled to be Tuesday, it was supposed to be Tuesday of this week, and then Thursday, and then Tuesday of next week, so if they ever open, the ECB will not grant any liquidity to these banks if Cyprus denies the terms of accepting a bailout. Now, it's a very rapidly moving situation, and there are immense implications, which is what I think a lot of people would like to get your reading on. There have been major reactions from Russia toward the beginning of the week, largely because this, as most people know, a large portion of the deposits in Cyprus are from large Russian companies, oligarchs, and the likes. And it was known when Cyprus joined the European Union that they were a tax haven, that being surrounded by water on all sides made them a perfect place to launder money. But there are currently, in anticipation of Cyprus having to raise this money over the weekend, there have been a lot of attempts to drag Russia into the bailout of Cyprus. They're referring to these plans as Plan B. Earlier this week, Russia was not informed of the decisions that were going on in Cyprus toward the beginning of the week. So the expropriation was a shock to them. Prime Minister Medvedev referred to the Troika as behaving like a bull in a china shop and likened its proposals, which would force Russian depositors to contribute their deposits to the rescue of Cypriot banks. It was compared to Soviet-era confiscations. Now, needless to say, this is creating major geopolitical tensions between the European Union and Russia. The implications of this are huge for other debtor nations in southern Europe: Spain, Greece, Ireland, Italy. So there are a number of questions that come up. And I'll say at the outset that this entire situation absolutely begs a Glass-Steagall solution, and from the United States, and then carried over into acted upon by the nations of Europe, sovereign nations of Europe. But the questions that come up, it was known that the move to expropriate depositors would create a massive panic, which it has. Why was it done? Was it sheer stupidity or something else? There are also, and then I'd like you to also address the broader geopolitical implications of the Cyprus crisis. What does it mean for the United States? What does it mean for other nations of Europe? What does it mean for Russia? So if you could address that.
Well, start right with where you ended, because that's where it is. This thing is not going to continue. It cannot. It now is geopolitical in the extreme. The United States itself is hopelessly bankrupt. That's a factor. In all the nations of Europe, you have, on the continent, you have only France and Germany which still have any significant credibility. Their credibility is being destroyed by them rapidly. So there's no hope. The U.S. situation is absolutely hopeless. You look at this in hyperinflation, which took over especially since 2007, but was started at the end of the term of office of Bill Clinton, as Graham Bliley, et cetera, right? And this was the greatest swindle ever pulled off inside the United States, was the Graham Bliley swindle, which a terrified then Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, who was under tremendous threats from all kinds of quarters, signed on to it. It was the worst thing he ever did, but he did it under tremendous pressure. This was and this had been planned long before Bill was ever president. It began in the beginning of at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. This whole swindle was pulled off. And the high point of the swindle was, of course, the George Bush administration, 3 George Bush administrations in point of fact. The old geezer and the young squib, the two of them. And then, of course, what's on now. So there is no hope for the continuation of the present world international monetary system now. India and China, of course, are major countries. There are other countries in the East who are independent countries in some degree and have an independent role. But the transatlantic region is the region that is crucial, because the world financial monetary system is actually located essentially in that region, around the Atlantic Ocean, on all shores. So we're on the end of the system. Now, the only way you could get out of this system, if you want to survive in the United States, if you want to have a life inside the United States, you will push through Glass-Steagall as early as you can, and I mean within weeks or days. Push it through now. It's the most important thing you can do for your life and the life of your family, the life of your friends inside the United States, and for the benefit of people in other parts of the world. This thing, if it blows, will mean that no one in the United States, even those who think they're very rich right now, they don't know what a real blowout is, because there will be nothing. Do you know what it's like for a nation or nations to reach the point that they have no money? They have no money in their banks, no money circulating in their accounts. Money has died. The greatest financial bubble ever conceived of, which would destroy the whole planet, starting with the transatlantic region. So that anybody who continues to oppose Glass-Steagall, whether wittingly or not, is a criminal, a mass criminal. There is no solution for the situation presently extant in the transatlantic region, except in Iceland, where they've decided to put Glass-Steagall through. And the only chance for the United States and the people of the United States is passing Glass-Steagall now. Now, what's the issue here? Why do people resist Glass-Steagall? Well, they're not really loyal Americans, I can tell you that. They're Wall Street types, and their interests lie in what? Since the time that a swindler became president of the United States, the United States economic interests have been chiefly, with some brief periods of exception, have been under the control of the British Empire. What happened was that in that situation, after the end of the term of one of our greatest presidents, Wall Street took over. And what was Wall Street? Wall Street was the British banking interest, the international British banking interest. And from that point on, the United States, up until the Civil War, the United States was dominated by the British banking interests, including some screwballs in Boston who were part of the same thing. Then again, we had the assassinations of presidents. And we had, during the beginning of the 20th century, we were, in terms of Wall Street, we were puppets of the British Empire. We continued to be that until Franklin Roosevelt. And the moment that Franklin Roosevelt died, another puppet, Harry Truman, took over on behalf of the British interest and virtually said to the British Empire, do what you want to. I'm here. You can count on Truman. And Truman never did anything to make the British Empire unhappy. So that's the situation we're in. We're in now at a point where the American people are going to have to decide, as well as other nations, whether they themselves are morally fit to survive. Because if they don't pass Glass-Steagall, and if the consequences of not passing Glass-Steagall are allowed to continue, they won't have anything, even their lives. So the question is, are the American people so stupid that they would refuse to ram through Glass-Steagall now? I can assure you, and I can assure anyone, that if Glass-Steagall were enacted this week or next week, that the United States would come through magnificently, and the rest of the world would be saved from the terrible global catastrophe. If they don't have the guts to put Glass-Steagall through now, or the brains to cause them to know they should put it there, then woe be them. We warned them. We did everything we could to stop them from their foolishness. If they go ahead and continue to support the forces against Glass-Steagall, they have no one to blame for their death and their agony and shame but themselves. But the point is, why do they do that then? Because their bank accounts are generally controlled by the British Empire, as it has been for a long time. Wall Street is nothing but a tool of the British Empire, of the Queen. The Queen owns all the money. And what she represents is the British Empire, which is really an empire. It's not just something Great Britain. This involves many other nations. Most of the nations of Africa are nothing but slaves of the British monarchy. The entire Euro system is a slave of the British monarchy. And the same thing goes around much around the world. And even though India and China and some other countries in Asia are independent, if this system goes in the transatlantic region, if Glass-Steagall is not brought through in the transatlantic region, what you may lose is the human species.